be joining us throughout. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to Ohad for agreeing to give this presentation. Like I said before, I'm excited to hear about Hakham Eliyahu Benamozegh, and I'm excited to be partnering with the Habura. The American Sephardic Federation Institute of Jewish Experience has been partnering for over a year, probably about 2 years already at this point, right? With the Rabbi Arthur Schneier International Program from Yeshiva University. I think around 2 years at this point.
Yeah.
So, it's nice to bring in other partners as well. And so thank you very much to the Habura for suggesting this program. And we encourage you to continue to see all the different programs out there, because we know there's a lot out there, and we try to only bring you the quality ones. So thank you all for coming. Just the technical issues, as always, your microphones and cameras will be off throughout the presentation. We do invite you to open your cameras and microphones afterwards. Please do. It's nice not to talk to a blank screen. So it's nice to see that there are actually people there, not just names. So please do that at the end. If you have questions, I will be monitoring the Q&A and chat throughout. So if I need to interrupt Ohad, I hope that's okay. I will interrupt you in the meantime. But in general, we'll let you go through with your presentation, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. Okay. And with that, I turn over the floor to Professor Ronnie Perlis.
Hi, thank you, Drora. Thank you to the ASF's Institute for Jewish Experience for this. It's really wonderful to partner with the Habura. They're doing great things all over the globe. And the Schneier program is committed to thinking and fostering global connections between different communities and diasporic ways of looking at the world. So this is really exciting. And today's featured Hakham, Benamozegh, is one of these figures that obviously is deeply rooted in the Italian humanist religious tradition, but is someone whose ideas really go way beyond the borders of Italy and the Mediterranean, and has a lot to say for us today. So I'm really excited for this. I want to just introduce Ohad Fedida, who attended Yeshivat Bet Moshe Chaim, which I don't think they pronounce it that way, but in Miami, where he studied under Harav Yohanan Zweig. I can attest that Rabbi Zweig is one of the great creative thinkers, and it's a real intellectual experience to be in his shiur, and he is also a Talmid of Rabbi Joseph Dweck and an active member of the Habura. Ohad has a BA in psychology from Florida International University and is aiming for his clinical psychology PhD. He currently works at the Center for Children and Families as a research and clinical assistant, and I'm very excited for today's presentation. So without any further ado, please, Ohad, take us through it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It means a lot. I would like to thank the ASF, Institute of Jewish Experience, for the opportunity. I would like to thank Yeshiva University, and especially the Habura. I'd like to specifically thank Dr. Drora Rusi and Dr. Ronnie Perlis for helping me navigate through this. And I'd like to also specifically thank Sina Kahan, and my good friend, who is always pushing me to take on more things and to be the best that I can be. So thank you, brother. I want to dedicate this class to Leilui Nishmat, my uncle, Michael Chaim Ben Yitzchak. May his neshama have an aliyah. So today we are going to talk about, I'm going to share my screen. We're going to speak about Hakham Eliyahu Benamozegh and the Jewish concept of progress in his work, how he understood this notion of progress in the Torah. So a quick disclaimer, which is I am not an expert in many things, especially Hakham Benamozegh. I just recently came I was introduced to him this year, and I fell in love with his works and with his thought. So just putting that out there, this is not a class, this is more of we're sharing together over here. So a little bit about the Hakham. So Hakham Eliyahu Benamozegh was born, raised, and died in Livorno from 1823 to 1900, and he's part of this big chain of hakhamim It's a little bit unknown, but underrated chain of hakhamim, Italian hakhamim. We have people like the Ramchal, we have people like Shadal, and we have Hakham Benamozegh. This man was brilliant, very, very, very brilliant. He was a massive halachist, massive Torah scholar, but at the same time, he was highly involved in an expert in Bible criticism, different languages, comparative religions. He was involved in science. So it's just this brilliant figure. He spoke in Italian and French and English, Hebrew, and he writes all his works in all these different languages. So for example, the book, the segment that we're going to be reading is from his book, Israel and Humanity, which he wrote in French, and it was translated into English. Now, so one of his two famous books. He is a little bit not of known. Eliyahu Benamozegh is not as known, but in recent years, he's, especially in academia, he's rising in popularity. One of his big works is Em LaMikra, which is a commentary on the entire Torah, and he brings in cutting-edge Torah thinking, and at the same time, he brings in philology and Bible criticism, comparative traditions. He brings in all of the science of his day to inspire his understanding of the text. And his other book that he wrote his famous book is Israel and Humanity, which is a very philosophical book. It could be compared almost like a mini Moreh Nevuchim of sorts, where he speaks about Israel and their placement in the world and humanity, and he deals with different elements in Jewish thoughts, such as progress. What's interesting about Hakham Eliyahu is that he's very much not a classical thinker. Like when we think of someone who's very much a Torah scholar and at the same time involved in science, we all immediately think of Rambam, he's a classic Maimonidean thinker, but he's very much not. He's a massive Kabbalist. He goes against the Rambam many times, but at the same time he still holds those two worlds true. So he's a very interesting figure to study. I will say, Joe, just to point out that in academia, how Hakham Eliyahu Benamozegh is presented, he's presented as this very, very liberal universalist who's very, all over the place. Like he's a global citizen who doesn't really have a basis, and that's very much not true. What sort of academia is seeing is a very classical approach to Torah, a classical approach that sees no contradiction between the world and the Torah, which sees the author of the world as the author of the book, as the same. So they see that and they don't know what to do with it. So they immediately say, oh, he's like this, this liberal, universalist who just accepts everything and he's just into everything. Like, he was very, very rooted and based, and he was a massive halachist. He was a big Jewish thinker, but he saw no contradiction between the world around him. He didn't make a distinction between religious truth and secular truth. He just saw truth. So that's a very important to recognize in his approach. So I shared over here some interesting resources. A great three-part series by Mark Shapiro, another great class by Mark Shapiro that was given at the Habura recently about Hakham Eliyahu Benamozegh's defense to this book, because it was actually burnt when it was transported over to Syria. They were not big fans of his work, and I gave over here. So I'll try to share all these links later on. Okay, so let's jump into it. So it's a very, very big book. It's a very big section. So what I took is snippets from the chapter that he deals with progress, and we'll go through it together. Also, his English is a little bit, meaning it was written like over 100 years ago in French, and then it was translated close to over 100 years ago. So the English is a little bit hard, but it's very, very fulfilling. It's a very cutting edge essay. I was blown away. Okay, so let's first establish what the theory is. So we know, and I'm going to be reading. So we know that the Talmud gives the world a total duration of 6,000 years divided into 3 periods of 2,000 years each. The first belongs to chaos, the second to the Torah, and the last to the Messianic era. In this outline, of a philosophy of history, which is to be noticed above all, is the character of progression of which Rabbinic Judaism has become so well aware that it raises it to the level of theory. So just like we have the theory of gravity, the theory of evolution, we have the theory of progress, which Rabbinic Judaism recognized, that we start from the tohu vavo of the beginning, and we're progressing into the Mashiach and ultimately Olam Haba. History is therefore not for Judaism a succession of facts without connection. It is an organism which develops. It is a world which forms and which has at its beginning chaos, the tohu vavo, Genesis, and at its end, the Shabbat, the name given to the Olam Haba, an imitation of the Sabbath, which ends the work of the 6 days. So immediately we see what he's talking about, which is, for the Torah, there's the world has a direction. God is taking his world someplace. There's a evolution, there's a progression where the world is leading to. It's not just arbitrary little pieces of history that have no connection to one another, but rather there's a line that's heading up. Now, how does this apply? So we're going to see how he takes this theory. And by the way, we hear this theory and we think like, oh, that's obvious, right? Because we're sort of seeped in it. We're sort of seeped in this idea of progress and evolution. And we fail to recognize that not every tradition accepted this. It's not built into every tradition. So later on, we're going to see some counterfactuals. What if this is not the case? But we're going to see how he applies this theory of progress into different aspects of Jewish thought. So the first we start off with is intellectual and religious progress. So let's read. So it cannot be denied that the rabbis adopted this assumption of religious evolution. The accusation made of them in the gospel of having put human traditions above the word of God is enough to prove that they were hardly partisans of immutability. The protest of the Sadducees, which is the Karaim, all the different groups other than the authentic or the rabbinate, and the very existence of this party confirms the reproaches of the Gospels. Even today, historical criticism without any hostile intention, on the contrary, recognizes in the Pharisees, which is the fancy name for the rabbis, the representatives of religious movement and progress within Judaism, although in a very different sense from ours. So what he's defining over here is that for the rabbis, the rabbinic institution was viewed as, is meant to be a religious progress, meaning is meant to be the mechanics of a religious, of an intellectual, of a halachic development. They're not static. And he brings over here the gospel, which is very common. Like, it's very strange to see, for us, it's very strange. Imagine if we had the Gedolim of our generation writing in their books, quoting John and the Gospels, and he quotes pagan sources. He's quoting, you're going to see this later on, especially if you read his works. He's quoting socialist French philosophers and different grammarians and people from the church, and it's actually very beautiful to see how he quotes everyone. But so he says that, listen, the fact that we have all of these sects, the Sadducees, the Karaim, and everything, and they looked at the rabbis and they say, look, you guys are the mechanic of evolution, of development. You developed the halakha, and they thought they criticized them for doing that, which is funny to think, because in our mind, when we think of the rabbinate, of the rabbis, we think of these highly conservative in the sense of holding back and trying to hold on to this tradition which doesn't develop. And in reality, the rabbis were the creative ones, were the ones who were innovating ideas and developing halakha. And the Karaites were saying, you guys are insane. You guys are reforming, basically. You guys are coming to me with the Gezerah Shava, with kicha misdeh Efron, which brings up in this example, money to the level of Deoraita. Like, that's insane. It doesn't say that anywhere in the Torah. Where are you getting this from? So the rabbis were the movers of religious evolution. And he says but now what he says is that this is, he qualifies it, and he says, the natural growth of an institution, its organic evolution, should not be confused with the changes that one would voluntarily introduce in order to adapt it to time and place. As much as the first modification is just, legitimate, orthodox in a word, is as much as the second is false, insulting for the idea that it claims to serve, and one could even say anti-scientific, because science does not know revolutions, but only the slow, unconscious transformation, the radical selection, the birur of the Kabbalists, which is not incompatible, far from it, with the principle of heredity, identity, and even with the notion of a special primitive type. So what he qualifies, and he says, this notion of progress that we identify with the rabbis is not the notion of progress and evolution of the reformers, of the revolutionists, the people who are trying to start revolutions. They are developing it from within, naturally, organically. There's a gradual progression to the development of Torah, to the development of halakha. This is not just, oh, today we have these values, today we have these values, and we're going to implant them externally and force it into the system. But rather, there's a science to halakha. We have Yud Gimel Midot that the Torah is understood through, and you use that to gradually develop it. So the rabbis were not radical revolutionists who didn't take heed to the identity of the body, and they weren't these ossified Karaites who never moved, but they were exactly the true body of religious evolution in its true sense of gradual, true development to the self, which is interesting. So there's a quote I brought in Jacob Katz, who's a Jewish historian, sociologist, and it's quoted in Rabbinic Creativity in the Middle East by Professor Zvi Zohar. I highly recommend Rabbinic Creativity in the Middle East. Great work. And he says over here, the claim of the Orthodox to be no more than the guardians of the pure Judaism of old is a fiction. In fact, orthodoxy was a method of confronting deviant trends and of responding to the very same stimuli which produced these trends, albeit with a conscious effort to deny such extrinsic motivations. So we have a quote over here by Jacob Katz who says, in light, we see today in our world today, how the orthodoxy sort of ossified, sort of became like these guardians of pure Judaism, that there's this pure Judaism, this pure tradition that we're trying to hold on to. And that's, as he says, a fiction. It's a myth. This does not exist in true understanding of halakha. There is no such thing as a true tradition that we're trying to hold on to. There's ikarim, there's principles that were handed down, and the rest develops and evolves and grows. It's a body that develops. We see this clearly in the introduction to the Mishnah of Rambam. So he says, he's talking about halachic development through using the Yud Gimel Midot, and he says, "Ve'en zman shelo haya bo hitbonenut vechidush ha'inyanim," meaning there was not one generation where we didn't have observation and then chidush, renewal. Ve'ayu chachmei kol dor misimim divrei hakodmim ikar v'ayu lomdim mehem umechadshim ha'inyanim. So he says, and the sages of every single generation would place the precedents, the principles that they received from the previous generation as ikar, as foundational, and then they would learn from that new ideas and develop new halachot. So in the Rambam's philosophy of halakha, this is the classical approach to halakha. The halakha, the Torah of Moshe that was given is different, is less than the halakha that we have today, because we have 2,000 years until that. And what we see is that every generation is mechadesh and introduces new ideas and new elements of halakha through this slow, gradual progress. So by definition, you're going to have, there's this idea of progress in halakha. Now, in Rabbinic Creativity, so there's this, he quotes Bialik. So Bialik, the father of Israel, so he has this point where he says, Bialik's acquaintance in Eastern Europe with such principled halachic rigidity may well have been the ground for his well-known characterization of halakha. Quote, halakha has an angry face, strict, severe, hard as steel, strict justice. It sets forth its rulings and leaves no room for differentiation. Its yes is yes, its no is no, fossilized piety, obligation, enslavement. This is how Bialik viewed halakha. And it's probably because he was in a culture, in a community, which didn't recognize that halakha evolves and develops. So the rabbis, a lot of throughout the generations, unfortunately, fell to this ossification, felt that they're just guardians and hadash min Torah. There's no such thing as development in the Torah. So he sees this and he makes this correct judgment. Halakha is an angry face that is fossilized piety. But that is if you're ossified, if you're stuck. If you're not stuck, there's an evolution. Now, it is interesting just to point out that, unfortunately, we are in Galut. And that sort of lends to it, because our capacity for true halachic and intellectual evolution and progress is extremely stunted because we do not have national sovereignty, because we do not have a Sanhedrin as the mechanism, as the body to allow such development. So our development compared to what is possible is extremely limited. So on some level, the fossilization of halakha is due to galut. The reason which adds context to when we sit on the floor and we're crying for a Bet HaMikdash and the Sanhedrin, on some level we're mourning the progress, we're mourning the fact that our halakha is stuck from 2,000 years ago with limited development and limited progress. We're mourning that progress. So moving on, I'm going to read this beautiful Agadah. It's in Menachot. The first part is what Hakham Benamozegh is going to be focusing on, but I'm going to read the whole thing just because it's very profound and beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful Agadot, in my opinion, in the Talmud. So let's read it. Amar Rav Yehuda Amarav, B'sha'ah she'ala Moshe l'maro metzao l'kadosh baruch hu sheyoshev v'kosher ketarim do'otiotav. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rab, when Moshe Rabbeinu went to the heavens, he found God. All this, by the way, is Agadah. It's not necessarily literal, but he saw God Kivyachol sitting and writing little the crowns and all the letters, the little trupchiks that we see in the Sefer Torah. So he said, Amar lefanav. He told him, Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe, mi ma'akev al yadcha. Who's holding you back? Meaning, who's forcing you? Who's making you do this? I know I don't get it. You don't get it. Whatever. Why are we doing these little crowns? Amar lo, God responds, Adam echad yesh atid liot besof kama dorot. There's going to be a man coming in a few generations. Akiva ben Yosef Shemo. His name is Akiva ben Yosef. Rabbi, the famous Rabbi Akiva. Sha'atid lidrosh al kol kotz v'kotz tilin shel halachot. Right? Who's going to come to extrapolate, to be doresh on every single one of these crowns, bodies and bodies of halachot. Amar lefnav, Moshe Rabbeinu said, Ribono shel olam, harehu li, show him to me. Amar lo, chazor la'achorecha, turn backwards. So he turns backwards, halach, ve'yashav besof shemona shurot. So Moshe Rabbeinu turns around and he's sort of taken to Rabbi Akiva's Bet Midrash. And he's sitting in the 8th row. He was sitting besof shemona shurot at the end of the 8th row. What does that mean, the 8th row? So back in the day, the Bet Midrash was set up that the Rav would sit at the front, and the Bet Midrash was rows of students. And the Rav would give his shiur, and you had the students who were the most time in the Bet Midrash and the most wise would be at the front. And as you got in terms of intelligence, in terms of wisdom, you had lower and lower and lower. Moshe Rabbeinu was at the last row. So in this Agadah, Moshe Rabbeinu walks into the Bet Midrash of Rabbi Akiva, and he's sitting in the last row, showing you that he lacked the understanding of the Bet Midrash of Rabbi Akiva. Velo haya yodea ma hen omrim. He didn't know what they were saying, right? The Rabbi Akiva was giving class, and he didn't know what was flying. Tashash kochov, he got weak. Kivan shehegia ledavar echad, once Rabbi Akiva got to one matter, amru lo talmidav. So his students ask, a good Jewish question, Rabbi minayin. Where did you get this? Right? What's the source? Amar lahen halacha leMoshe miSinai. So Rabbi Akiva is sitting there. Moshe Rabbeinu is in the last row. He's teaching this new innovation, this new halacha that Moshe Rabbeinu has no idea what he's talking about. The student raises his hand and says, Rav, what is the source? Rabbi Akiva says, halacha leMoshe miSinai. Moshe is sitting there. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Nityashva da'ato. Moshe Rabbeinu is, he got relaxed. Now let's go, let's finish this Agadah just because it's so beautiful, but the focus is going to be at this first part. So, you have this impressive man and you're going to give the Torah on my hand? Right, give it to him. Be quiet, this is what came up in my mind, meaning this is this is the way I run the world. Amar lefanav, Ribono shel olam. Okay, hereatani torato, herani secharo. Okay, you showed me his Torah. Show me his sachar. Show me his reward. Amar lo, chazor la'achorecha, chazar la'achorav, ra'a sheshuklim besaro bemokalim. So he turned around, and he was taken to future, and he sees that they were pulling his skin with iron combs. Rabbi Akiva was one of those Tanaim who unfortunately were tragically murdered by the Romans And what they were doing, they were torturing him. They were pulling his skin. Amar lefanav, Ribono shel olam, zo Torah vezo secharat. This is Torah and this is its reward. Amar lefanav, shtok, kach ala b'machshava lefanai. He told him, be quiet. This is what came to my mind. Meaning, this is the way I run the world. So it's a very profound agadah. It's one of my favorite ones. I still don't understand the end. I guess that's the point. Shtok, kach ala b'machshava. But so the beginning, Hakham Benamozegh is going to focus on this in the context of religious and intellectual halachic development. Okay. But what is certainly very significant is that the Pharisees, the rabbis, with astonishing certainty of conscience, do nothing to repel the accusation of novelty addressed to them by their adversaries. They do nothing to apologize for the fact that they're doing chidushim. They say, you're right, because that's halakha. They place Rabbi Akiva without hesitation above Moses, the representative par excellence of the not only practical but theological tradition. The only one, says the Talmud, who was able to devote himself without danger to the study of the Merkavah. It is related in another passage that when Moshe went up to Sinai to receive the law, God made him see all the future generations of his successors. Right? So he's saying, look, the rabbis in their Agadah over here in Menachot place Rabbi Akiva of a Tanah of later generations above Moshe Rabbeinu, the one who gives the Torah himself. In the farthest row, he saw Rabbi Akiva, who on every little word of the Torah preached mountains of doctrines. And as Moses did not understand what the rabbi was saying, he experienced acute grief and did not come down until he heard Rabbi Akiva, who concluded by saying, all these doctrines come to us from Moshe, who received them at Sinai. This prodigious passage comes to us from Moshe, who received, this prodigious passage would constitute the most subtle denigration of the written Torah if it was not in reality the most profound apology. This image of Moses, who does not understand what is said in his name, what he would therefore have preached himself, and who is only reassured when he intends to link the most modern Pharisaic, the rabbinic theories to his own teachings at Sinai, is a masterpiece of truth and depth. There is here a whole system of concordance of written law and oral law, of immutability and progress condensed in a few words. So he's saying, we see from this Agadah of Rabbi Akiva, we see the entire theory of halachic progress, the perfect balance of what we're talking about. Would the seed, if it were endowed with intelligence, if you had a seed and you gave it consciousness, would it be recognized in the plant? If it looked at the plant, could it say, oh, you know that's going to be you? Right? Obviously, he would never say, oh, yeah, that's going to be me. Does the child recognize himself in man? I mean, when you have a little kid and you tell him, oh, you see that adult? That's how you're going to be, right? He can't connect. No, because the difference is too great and the consciousness and memory are not there to attest to continuity, the identity of existence. But the plant would recognize itself in the germ. Man will recognize itself in the child because evolution being already an acquired fact, all the moments of existence are linked to each other and form an uninterrupted chain, which allows the being to assert his own identity. That's what he says. But on the other hand, the plant could recognize himself in the seed. The adult can recognize himself in the child, can say, yes, when you look at baby pictures, yes, I was that child before. Why? Because you see a continuous progress and you're over here so you can see. So now what is this comparable to? The Agadah with Rabbi Akiva. You have Moshe Rabbeinu with the seed of the Torah. He can't see the progress and the evolution and how the Torah will be developed. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, can say, Halacha leMoshe miSinai. All this progress, all this evolution, all of this brilliance that I'm talking about is stemming from the seed of Moshe Rabbeinu. So it's not now, this is the perfect balance. It's not ossified halachic thinking where the seed stays the seed forever. Moshe stays Moshe. It's progress. So the seed becomes this towering figure of Rabbi Akiva. But at the same time, it's not this revolutionary reformation, which doesn't see a chain from the seed to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva can still say, Halacha leMoshe miSinai. He says over here is a beautiful insight about the blessing of the Torah that we say every morning before we study. So he says, finally, still by virtue of the same principles, the rabbis explain to us why the Jewish call to read the Torah in the synagogue does not say in the blessing which precedes the reading, blessed are you, O Lord, who gave the Torah. It doesn't say, Natan HaTorah. It says, blessed are you, O Lord, who gives the Torah. Noten HaTorah. In the present, it's current. Noten HaTorah. Because they add, the Torah is not given once or 10 times, nor 1,000 times for all, but it is given continuously. It is a spring which gushes out and never dries up. So we see this notion of progress even in the blessing of Torah. Now, anyone who's hearing this, right, who's studied a little bit, is going to tell me, okay, that's very nice, Benamozegh, but you can't pull this one over me. I know that the rabbis speak very highly of the past, of the hakhamim of the past, and they speak a little bit lowly of the new hakhamim, of the new development. So that's a contradiction. How do we deal with that? So now Benamozegh is going to deal with that. And he says, we admit that one could easily find passages which seem to contradict this doctrine, since they put the former hakhamim indefinitely above the new ones, lavishing on the former the most pompous titles and praises, and on the latter more contemptuous qualifications. Right? They talk about the low ones as nothing. There's this line in the Talmud, I forgot where it is. One of the Tanaim says, if the Rishonim, if those who came before us were men, we are donkeys, and not even good donkeys, bad donkeys. Right? So in Talmudic humor. But the contradiction disappears, in our opinion, as soon as we distinguish between the individual and the masses. Great individuals are more numerous and more remarkable in ancient times than in modern times. And it is this decrease that we deplore. What rises, on the contrary, is the general level of the crowd, thanks to the greater diffusion of knowledge facilitated by these admirable instruments which are writing and printing. So he says, he explains that, yes, there is seeming contradiction, but it's not a contradiction. In the past, there are individuals who were the pillars of the universe. But if we look at the masses, if we look at the state of being, we are clearly at a much higher state. The individuals might be smaller, but the state of being is much higher. So let's read this next piece. According to the idea that Rabbinic Judaism has of the golden age, the first men were naturally better endowed with certain faculties, in particular spontaneity or inventive faculty. The truth is, near the origins, not only is the human organism more active, but moral activity too is more intense. So he recognizes how at the beginning, at the origins, the potential is bubbling, is a lot more powerful. So by definition, the individuals who are wielding that power are going to be a lot more powerful. They're the pillars of the universe. Now, as that is evolved and takes place and manifests in the world, you're going to have less potential in every single individual, but as an overall state, we're on a much higher level. Let's just compare the fact that you have an Avraham Avinu who introduces monotheism to the world, is a pillar of the universe. He's sitting on one side and literally the entire rest of the world is on another side. That's so powerful. That's we can't even compare, we can't even understand what kind of potential of the how much power that is. So today, the fact that we're not an Avraham Avinu, we do not have that power, but at the same time, every single person recognizes when he's born the ideas, the notions of monotheism, which took Avraham Avinu an entire lifetime to recognize. The Ramchal, Derech Hashem, has a very similar idea on Israel and the nations. So he speaks about it in terms of roots and branches, that early generations are the roots, and then we are the branches, and the roots have a lot more potential, but the branches are a lot more perfected. And the branch is technically limited within the development of the root, but it is still a lot more perfected than the root. So we can compare this with the intensity of a Big Bang, which is bursting with energy and power. That's very, very powerful. But let's compare that to the detailed brilliance of an eye, right? The end goal, the perfected evolution of that. Clearly, that's a lot more power. That's a lot more perfected, even though it lacks the power of a Big Bang. Actually, I was going over this, and I remember in first grade, my rabbi, so he gave an example. He said how early generations is like if you look at the kotel, right? So the kotel is built of big stones at the bottom, and then as it goes up, it's smaller and smaller stones. The stones at the bottom are big, they're heavy, they have a lot of weight on them, they're carrying a lot of weight on them, they're essentially the cornerstone of the wall. But as you go up, you get smaller and smaller and smaller, but at the same time, you're higher. So as much as the bottom is low, is much more powerful, is much heavier, is much bigger, you're still on the floor. And as you get higher, you might be smaller, but you're in the air, right? So today, the children with mother's milk in their mouth has a better scientific understanding a better understanding of the world around them than what it took major big scientists years of their lives in antiquity. So this is how he solves that paradox. Now we're going on to progress and metaphysical placement of man. So this notion of progress in terms of where does man stand in the universe? So the rabbinical opinion, which puts the nature of man above the nature of the angel, obviously stems from the idea that the former is capable of progress, while the latter is confined to stillness, right? So they place man above the angels. And the reason why we're above the angels is because we have movement, while the angels are confined to stillness. And indeed, while walking characterizes man and the locutions of walking before God, walking with God, are in rabbinic Judaism synonymous with virtue and religion, angels are, on the contrary, qualified as stationary. And now he's going to interpret this other Agadah, which is beautiful. In the Jerusalem Talmud, the rabbis go so far to assert as proof of this immobility that the angels have their legs together, that they have only one foot, and that they have no joints. In short, they give us a description which reminds us of the images of the Egyptian gods revealed to us by modern discoveries. So in the Talmud Yerushalmi, so we have this image. They present the angels as these one-legged, no jointed creatures, like basically flamingos. And people take it literally, so they're thinking that there's like these flamingo angels flying around. But in reality, what Benamozegh is interpreting is saying what they were trying to present is how the angels, while very high up, while in the hierarchy, metaphysical hierarchy, are still limited in terms of they're stationary, while man has the capacity to evolve, to progress, to develop. So he's technically above the angels. And I brought some sources where we see this notion of walking as spoken as virtue. Noach was walking God. Right? Walk before me and be whole. And lastly, walk in his ways. Now we're going to refine the approach, and this is what Benamozegh does all the time. He brings from the traditions around him, and then he elevates it, meaning he shows how in Judaism it might be perfected. In some ethnic religions, when he says ethnic religions, he's talking of paganism, of polytheistic religions. It is said that Jupiter needs the righteous man more than he needs Jupiter. And Plotinus, invited by his disciples to attend the sacrifice, replied, "It is up to the gods to come to me rather than me go find him." Very ballsy move. The gods come to me, I don't come to you. The reader who knows what Rabbinic Judaism thinks of human perfectibility will have no difficulty seeing how, from the Jewish point of view, the response of the Neoplatonic philosopher is corrected, in a sense, which further emphasizes the dignity of the man while respecting the majesty of God, without whom there would be no progress. So in Judaism, we agree, you're right. Man is above the angels, but at the same time, we have respect that this halicha that we're engaged in, this evolution that we're engaged in, is in his world, and we give that respect. Now, so let's move on to the notion of progress in the notions of Mashiach. So every religion has this notion of a perfected state of Mashiach, and we're going to see how in the Jewish tradition, because of this theory, this scientific theory of progress, how we identify it. So two elements, there's an optimism and an active element, and we're going to explore. So we are defined by hope. The presence of the doctrine of progress in Judaism is moreover so indisputable that independent critics and thinkers belonging to no church do not hesitate to recognize it. Quote, "The whole life of the Jewish people," said one of them, one of the church leaders, "is an aspiration, a preparation. And without attributing to Persia and Judea a thoughtful conception of progress, can we not say that they sensed and made possible the advent in the world by their indestructible confidence in a better future?" Our nation is defined by tikva, by hope. We're committed to this notion of progress, that the world will evolve, will become better. And this is defined in how we set up our Jewish calendar, other than just technical differences in calculations. So all the voices of Judaism agree in predicting the future perfection that the philosophers of ethnic religions fail to imagine. Furthermore, the doctrines of divine providence, hashgacha, which is for Israel is the pivot of history, is the complete opposite of the ethnic religious principle of history without morality. So it's completely the opposite of how the polytheists viewed history, as this brutal, cruel place which has no direction, no connection, where it's just these forces which are fighting with one another. The great year of the non-Jew bears an apparent resemblance to those cosmogonic periods which Kabbalah calls Shemitot or Yovlim, and whose idea we believe is found in the Bible itself. And there's between the two notions this capital difference that the ethnic religious cycles offer only a repetition of such of the same things, while the Hebrew cycles are returns, but under even better conditions, that in them the idea is therefore affirmed, development, and progress. So while for the ethnic religions, while they do have basis, while the fact that the world has a cycle to it is found in the Torah, the fact that we have Shemitah, the fact that we have Yovel, right? There's this constant cyclical nature to our calendar. The key difference between us and them is that our calendar develops like a staircase, develops a spiral staircase going up. So while for them it's just a never-ending cycle, for us, it develops upward. So technically I can pinpoint, I can say, oh, look, Pesach, 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 and I can dot a line. I can say a line through all the Pesachs that I experienced. But each Pesach, I experience it at a higher floor, at a higher level. This is an image of a staircase. Now let's compare that. Now I said before that we sort of take this for granted, that, oh yeah, the world develops and becomes better and there's a progress. And this is not accepted by all traditions. Let's look at this image. Let's go to the Buddhist tradition. And let's look at their image. Let's look at their understanding of cosmic progression, of their cosmic calendar. A lot scarier than ours. You have these 6 cycles of death and rebirth, where you have from these disgusting animals to sick people to normal humans to kings to gods, and then again to sick animals. And it's like this never-ending cycle of suffering. And they call this never-ending cycle of suffering samsara. I'm not a Buddhist expert, but I just wanted to bring because it's interesting to compare. So over here, I'm quoting from the Buddha by Karen Armstrong. So samsara is the keeping going, the cycle of death and rebirth, which propels people from one life to the next, the transience and restlessness of mundane existence. Quote, when he looked at human life, Gautama, which is the name of Buddha, could see only a grim cycle of suffering, which began with the trauma of birth and proceeded inexorably to aging, illness, death, sorrow, and corruption. So all he saw is suffering. And so what's the solution? Nibbana, which is nirvana. It's a process of extinction, blowing out the flame of life, the extinction of self, which brings enlightenment and liberation from pain. So for them, there's this never-ending cycle of pain and suffering called samsara, and the way out of it is for the self to transcend the cycle, sort of leave the cycle of pain and suffering, and that extinguishing the flame, which is fueled by desire or fueled by ignorance. And she says over here, Karen Armstrong's a very interesting point, the Hebrew Bible called this state of wholeness and completeness shalom. Gautama, Buddha, spoke of nibbana, of nirvana, and left his home in order to find it. So she's comparing the notion of shalom, of Shabbat, of wholeness, of yichud that we're talking over here, about this progress, that this yichud that we're getting to. And she's saying, look, it's similar to the notion of nibbana, of nirvana. And while it's true that we're both seeking this state of wholesomeness, of shalom, there's a key difference between the view of how the Buddhists view it and how the Jews view it. And that's expressed in the episode with Yaakov. So Yaakov is this Ish Tam Yoshevo Alim. For his entire life, he was basically this innocent, whole. He was a Buddhist monk. He was sitting fully absorbed in study and the appreciation of the world around him. And then he's thrust out of his home and he's meant to go deal with work and deal with the world around him. And before that, he has a dream. And in his dream, he sees so he sees a ladder with its feet grounded over here in this world, heading up to Olam Haba with malachim. And what's the diuk? Olim ve'yordim. We would think that it's the angels coming from above going down, but in reality, it's angels coming down up. In reality, what he saw was that Hashem was showing him, look, you can't escape this world. It's unhealthy to try to reach nirvana by sort of transcending, by leaving the cycle. The cycle, the transience, the suffering of the world around us is what builds Olam Haba. There's no Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. There is They're together. This is what Rambam writes in Morin Gulfim. They're the same thing. And the emergent property of an Olam Hazeh is the Olam Haba. The Olam Hazeh develops, is we bring it up, we elevate it, we develop it into an Olam Haba. So the Malachim come from down, up. You build your Olam Haba through this world. You can't escape it. So Yaakov is thrust into the world, and then he becomes a shepherd, and he needs to work, and he needs to engage in business, and he needs to become this very worldly man. And this is the key difference, this active element of it's not only reaching shlemut. The shlemut must be from the transience, from the world needs to progress and develop into shlemut. You can't leave the world behind you. And it's interesting to note, there's this great book I read. If you're interested in sociology, I highly recommend it. It's called American Jubilee. I don't know if you can see it. Whatever, I'll show you after. But American Jubilee, it's about American Jewish Buddhists, about how they essentially developed Buddhism in America, which is totally overrepresented by Jews. We're the smallest population. We control that entire, we developed the entire Buddhist movement in America. And one of the key things that all the Jewish Buddhist teachers did in America was introduce the element of activism. So they said, we love Buddhism, we love it all, but we cannot accept this notion of separating from the world. So all the Jewish teachers of Buddhism, and they essentially defined the entire nature of Buddhism in America, they introduced the active elements of being a participant of, and they took Buddhism to the streets. They helped with social problems, with the civil rights movements, and it's very interesting to see that this notion of Jewish progress includes the world. Now that leads into material progress, which for the Jews, and this is what the Hakham Benamozegh is going to introduce over here, that the progress is not only linear, but rather has depth to it. It's a holistic development. So it's not enough just to have intellectual or spiritual enlightenment. It's not enough. You need to have physical enlightenment as well. The world needs to be there up with you. It suffices to remember that the very material promises of Mosaism, of Moshe, which for the Messianic era took on such great proportions to be convinced that the religious and moral regeneration of man could not be separated from the regeneration of the planet itself. It's not enough just to have a religious and moral perfection, but the planet itself must also be perfected. The hope of material happiness in its primitive form and in the later belief of millennialism therefore appears to us to be of essentially Jewish origin, as well as that of the moral perfection of humanity. And this is what M. Laurent supposes when he adds this important confession, and he's a French thinker. I believe he's associated with the Christians. I couldn't really find anything about him. So he quotes from M. Laurent, there is in the opposition of the Jews against Jesus Christ and in their belief in another Messiah, a keen sense of the real needs of the humanity, needs which must be satisfied in this world. The Messianic age of Christians is purely mystical. Christianity has never dreamed of achieving on this earth the fraternity, the equality, the peace which it promises to believers. All these hopes are for heaven. The protest of the Jews against this mysticism was like a call to the future. The appeal was heard. Christian doctrines are beginning to penetrate into civil society, but it is in a way despite Christianity, despite the church, at least which is its organ. This required influence in the elements which are hostile to the religion of Christianity. This is proof that the Jews were in some ways right not to join the gospel. They remained faithful even in their struggle to their prophetic mission. So what he's identifying is saying the Christian notion of a perfected world was purely mystical. Jesus comes, and that's it. Here's the Messiah. And the Jews look around them, and they see people starving on the street, no running water. The world is falling apart. Chazaku Baruch, Jesus, you're a brilliant man. You're bringing spiritual enlightenment to the world. But what about the world? We cannot accept that this is the perfected state of man that we're waiting for. So we're going to wait. We have this hope that the world will develop, will evolve, not only spiritually and not only intellectually, but also mamash, the world itself. And this is Le Halacha, the Rambam in Mishneh Torah, his last halacha of his entire book. He's speaking about Mashiach, and he says, Uve'oto hazman lo hiyesh sham lo ra'av ve'lo milchama. So at this time of Mashiach, there's not going to be hunger, there's not going to be war, ve'lo kina ve'tacharut she'atova tiyeh mushpat harbeh, that the good is going to be highly influential. And all of the pleasures of the world are going to be spread like dirt to everyone, right? You can go into the soup, to go into Costco, and this is what that means. And the goal of the world will only be to know God, to have an experiential relationship with God. Therefore, Israel, the nation of Israel, is going to be the hakhamim, because they're committed to this notion. So they're going to be the teachers. This notion of knowledge of God is going to fill the world like water. But what we see is that Harambam is posek la'alacha, that this state of Mashiach, it must include physical and material development and perfection as well. And it's let's just keep in mind that he's writing this over 850 years ago, and he's basing it off of Masechet Sanhedrin and the Talmud, which was written over 1,000 years ago. They didn't have Wi-Fi, running water. They didn't have anything back then, and they're writing this as their students probably read this as magic. And today we live in a time where America can feed the world 3 times over if we wanted, where we're shocked that there's a war in Ukraine. It's very sad that there's a war in Ukraine, but the fact that we're shocked that there's a war indicates that look, we're not used to war. Back in the day, war was something very common. So there's material progression into Judaism as well. So in terms of Benamozegh extends this into cosmic progress. So he takes it more literally than a lot of the hakhamim of the past. And he recognizes that, look, yes, there is actually different worlds. He takes the Midrash, Amar Rabbi Abahu, Mikan shakadosh baruch hu haya borei olamot umecharivan, borei olamot umechayivan, ad shebara et elu, Amar dayan hanyan li yaton la hanyan li. Right? He creates a world, destroys it, creates a world, destroys it, essentially allows the evolutionary mechanics to take place until he identifies the perfected world. Do I have more time?
I want to, before you, that's why I put on my camera. I don't know if you see me, but I don't want to get into the next topic because I think that we're just opening a can of worms here again. But I think that there was a lot there. So let's let everybody breathe for a moment and see if you have any questions. I know that Professor Perellis was following along. He had a fascinating point there. I also noticed that I love the fact that the Italian hakhamim, and if you go to the Lazzatos or even Lazzato Marpugo, also the concept of bringing in the different philosophies together, which I think they do even more than many of the others we had. So I took that away for sure. I'm going to invite everybody now to open your cameras and open your microphones. Well, only open your microphone if you have something to say, please. And please do, so we see who's here. And if you have questions, either put them into the chat or open your microphone, like I said. So please do accept. I'm asking you to rejoin as a panelist. Professor Perellis, if you have something.
Yeah, I'll start off with a question. So how did most people are not very familiar with Benamozegh? How did you come across him, and what have you seen more interest in him in the wider world of Torah?
So I came to him because of my involvement with the Habura, which is inspired by a lot of the classical Sephardi approach to Torah, which, as I mentioned in the beginning, we saw no contradiction with the world, with the world and Torah. So we discuss a lot of these thinkers, and that's where I came across him. And he's very cutting edge and sophisticated. So I mean, as you can see, yeah. And being a little bit more contemporary, he talks to a lot of current issues. And I think that he's becoming in a lot of more popular in a lot of these types of circles that are seeking out a Torah that is cutting edge, a Torah that is relevant to their life. And for anyone who's interested in that, yes, Benamozegh and people like Benamozegh, Shadal, Manito, all these people are becoming a lot more popular.
Wonderful. A lot of people here on. Any of you have a question you want to share? Love to hear from you guys.
Or comment? Maybe everything you said was
Yeah,
so clear. I thought there was a lot there.
Comments are very clear, really very well presented. I just want to say, not easy stuff. There's a lot there, a lot to unpack. And when he would quote the Mamrei Chazal, he would quote them in Hebrew and then translate, or he just had it in translation in the original?
The translation, I don't know how he would do it in the French, but at least in the English translation, it's in English.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is like how he quotes from such a wide array of people. Like who quotes from direct quotes from the gospel, from church leaders, from pagans, like very impressive. And it's no shock that they burnt his books in Syria, meaning they were going through a little issue with Reformation, and all of a sudden you have this guy who's quoting you the gospel. So that was a quick delete for them.
Wonderful. And can you get those books easily?
No. It's a little bit difficult to get his books. Emla Mikra, which is his commentary on the Chumash, I'm going to share. I'll try to put out.
Are there links? Any of these available in PDF form or something? At least parts of them.
Yes, I'll try to find the links.
You don't have to find it right now. If you send it to me, I'll send it as a follow-up email.
That'd be great. This has been wonderful.
Okay, Ohad, if you send me whatever, and also I know there were some links in your presentation as well. If you're open to sending them, then I will share them with everybody who was here and not here. Oh, here it's here.
I put it into the chat. I'm going to send it to you as well.
Yeah, send it to me as well. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Ohad, for this presentation. And yes, there was the rest of it also, and I'm sure there's a lot more here.
Yeah, it's like when the Kohen Gadol says at the end, where he says more, he reads only certain sections of the parasha. So then he tells the a lot more than what I have written is over here. So I highly recommend everyone to look into the books of Hakham Benamozegh and a lot more of these big thinkers. So thank you so much.
And we invite you back next week for the third in this series with the Habura. So we hope to see you all back same time, same place next week. And thank you again. Have a great weekend. Have a Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. Bye.